Happy Knitters, and welcome back to my channel. So today is going to be a video tutorial about the true Afterthought heel with contrast toe, heel, and cuff. This is a video that you guys have been requesting, and I finally, after several months, have finally finished filming it. So it took a few months, so you may notice some nail polish changes throughout the video, so that is particularly why. This is going to be the sock that is in this tutorial. As you can see, it's a contrast heel, toe, and cuff. And I did something a little different on the Afterthought heel as far as the closure. I did not do the Kitchener stitch. I did an alternative to that I was trying out on this heel. So you will not see the Kitchener stitch in this tutorial, but there are plenty other tutorials out there that will show you how to do the Kitchener stitch. Besides, I'm not that great at it myself. I mean, I can do it, but I want to try something a little different, and I will give you my opinion on the closure that I used in this tutorial at the end. So stay tuned for that, so you'll see what my thoughts were on that. So throughout this tutorial, I will be referencing my first video 2 at a time sock tutorial with the Fleegle heel, because in this tutorial I do show you the complete sock, but there are parts of this tutorial that go a little bit faster than others because I've already slowed that down in that particular video. So I'm going to be referring throughout this tutorial to that other video, and I will put a link down in the description box below so that you can reference that, and it'll also be in the link above in this tutorial, so you can just click on it if you need to refer back to it. So I hope you guys are going to like this tutorial. Like I said, it's been highly requested and it's been a long time coming, so I hope that you enjoy. If you could give this video a thumbs up and subscribe and tell all your friends about it, and I appreciate it. Thank you. So the materials you're going to need for this tutorial is going to be 1 skein of yarn divided evenly. And in this case, I used Knit Picks Felici in the colorway Rainbow. You are also going to need to have another skein for your heels, toes, and cuffs. And I use Pattern Croy sock in the colorway Flax. So you are going to also need a pair of scissors, some bulb shaped stitch markers, a tapestry needle, a progress keeper. You are also going to need, for me, I like to knit my socks with the size US size 1 2.25 millimeter, but whatever needle size that you normally knit your socks in would be fine. And you're also going to need a tape measure. Okay, so I'm going to start by showing you a sock that I knit last year with a contrast heel, toe, and cuff. I think it'll make it a little bit easier to understand what we're going to be doing in this tutorial. So let me grab my sock blockers and put that on for you so you'll be able to see it a little bit better. Okay, so now that I've got the sock blocker on, so basically we're going to knit this sock toe up. So as you can see, we've got a contrast toe, heel, and cuff, and this is going to be with the Afterthought heel, and we're going to start with the toe and work our way up, and we're going to put in or cut in the Afterthought heel once we are done completely knitting the body of the sock. So now we are going to start with the cast on for the toe, and you guys have seen this in my other tutorial, and I'm going to link it up in the description box below, because in that tutorial I use worsted weight yarn, so it's a little bit better for you to see. But I will tell you that I like to use, for my toe up patterns or toe up socks, I like to use this seam free rounded toe pattern by Lynn Ashton on Ravelry. It's a free pattern, and it just gives your socks a really nice round toe instead of the wedge look, if that's what you're wanting to go with. So I highly recommend this pattern if you're looking more for a rounded toe. So here we're going to use the Turkish Cast On because that's my cast on of choice. And of course you can use whatever cast on that you like and that you are familiar with. But we're going to start with a slip knot. And I want to encourage you guys to watch my first tutorial because I go a whole lot slower on that particular video, the 2 at a time video with the Fleegle heel. But I will show you in this video, but it's going to be on sock yarn and it's going to be a little bit faster. So first we start with the slip knot. You put the slip knot on the bottom of your needles. Of course, this is magic loops, so your needles are oriented with the tips pointing to the right. And now you're going to make the number of loops that you like for your socks. And in my case, since I use Lynn Ashton's pattern, I will loop around 14 times from the front to the back. And I will do this for each of my socks. So once you have the appropriate amount of stitches for the first sock, you're going to secure that sock by putting the yarn in between the needles so that you will secure that yarn. And you want to go back and double check to make sure that you have the correct amount of stitches on your sock needle. So as you can see here, I did not have the correct amount, so I just made the adjustment. And now the first sock is complete. Just want to double check. I like to double check and double check because you don't want to start a sock and then find out later on that you don't have the right amount of stitches. Okay, so now that we are done casting on for the first sock, we're going to do the exact same thing for the second sock. We are going to start with a traditional slip knot, and then we are going to take that slip knot and place it on the bottom needle for magic loop for the Turkish cast on. We're going to slide it right on exactly like we did the first sock, and then we're going to snug that slip knot up. And then we're going to start wrapping from, I think on the first one I said from front to back, but it is actually from back to front. So we're going to put on 14 stitches, 14 loops. And then we're going to go ahead and secure those 14 loops by putting the yarn in between the needles to secure it. So let's double check our loops to make sure we have the correct amount on, and then we can continue with this tutorial. Okay, so now we have both of the loops for both socks on, so now we are ready to begin the process for the Turkish cast on. Okay, so we are going to pull the bottom needle long, and then we are going to take that loop that was securing the other loops, and we're just going to just gently drop it off with our finger holding that first loop in place. So we're going to take our needle and we are going to insert it in between the needle and the cord. This cord is kind of clear, so it may be a little bit difficult to see. But then we're going to just knit off the first stitch, and we're going to continue in this method, knitting each of the loops until we get to the end of the sock. So now we're coming down to the end of the first sock, and as you can see, there is a slip knot on the bottom loop. We are not going to do anything with that slip knot yet. We'll take care of that later on in the sock. So now we're going to continue on with the second sock, and we are going to drop that loop as we did on the first sock, and just kind of gently just drop it off, but keep securing that first loop with your finger. And we're going to insert the needle in between the cord and the needle, and then we are going to go ahead and pull a little tight on that first stitch, and we are going to knit it off as a normal stitch. And we are going to continue in this method on the second sock just by knitting each of the loops. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of the first sock, and we are going to knit that last stitch, and as you can see, the slip knot is still attached, so we're going to keep it on there, and we're going to flip our needles over, and we're going to get back to ready position for magic loop. So we're pulling the top cord back through to get the needles back oriented into magic loop position with the points still oriented to the right. So now we are going to pull that bottom needle long, and this time we are going to take the first slip knot off and just drop it. We don't need it anymore. Okay, so now you are going to insert your needle through the first loop, and you are going to pull just a little tight on that first one, and you are going to just knit the stitches off the needle. So now we are coming to the last stitch on this first sock, and so we are done. The Turkish cast on is pretty much done for this first sock. So now we're going to continue on to the second sock. Just make sure that when you're doing magic loop, you remember to drop your working yarn before you pick up the other working yarn for the second sock, so you don't actually end up knitting them together. So we're going to insert our needle into the second sock. We've dropped the slip knot, and we're going to tug up just ever so slightly on that first stitch, and we're going to take the tail and pull a little bit because that kind of cinches it together, and we're going to knit across this second sock as we did the first sock, and you'll be finished with that Turkish cast on for that sock as well. Okay, so now we are coming to the end of the first stitch. So now we are going to be ready for starting the increase on our toes. So let's get back to magic loop position, which is always with us pushing our top needle back into our stitches and pulling our bottom needle out to begin knitting in the round. Okay, so now we're going to pull our bottom needle long, and we're going to knit the first stitch, and then we are going to make an increase in for the second stitch. You can do a make one left, make one right, whatever you're comfortable with, but I do have a new video called a yarn over increase that makes it super simple, and I'll list the link above for you to click on. But I think that is probably one of the easiest and most simple increases for socks. So basically you're gonna, like I said earlier in this video, I'm using the Lynn Ashton pattern, so I'm following her increases for the toe. But if you just want a traditional wedge toe, it would be knit 1, increase, go all the way down to the end of the first sock, and you would increase 1 and then knit the last stitch, and you would do that every other round. So it's going to be an increase row on the front and the back. You're going to do it all the way around, and then you're going to do an even row of knitting where you're just going to knit without any increases. So whatever method or pattern that you like to use for your increases, this is where you would follow those instructions. And you're going to perform these increase and even rows until you get to the desired number of stitches that you like for your socks. My stitch count for these socks, all of my socks, are 64, but yours may be 56, yours may be 60. So it just depends on what your width of your foot is and kind of what you normally like to knit as far as the stitch count for your socks. So continue to do your increase row, your even row, until you get to your desired number of stitches, and I'll show you what to do next in regards to changing the color for the body of the sock. Okay, so now I want to show you, so I have finished my increases on my socks, and I forgot to tell you a little bit earlier, you want to put a progress keeper on the front to tell you which is the front of the sock and which is the back, because that'll tell you when you have completed a round. So I have gotten to 64 stitches on my stitch count, but as you can see, the toe is still somewhat tiny. So I want to show you just on a sample some of the socks that I've knit in the past, and as I told you before, it depends on your preference as to how long you want your color for your toes. So it really is, just like I said, just depends on what you want. So on this first sock, my first color change is almost exactly 2 inches on the dot. On the second one is slightly over 2 inches, but pretty much around that same amount. So what I like to do is I like to try on the sock to see what it looks like and if I'm comfortable with the color change. So you will continue to knit evenly without any increases with your toe color, and then come back and I'll show you how to add the second color. So now it's time to check to see where we are as far as the length of the toe. And so we're going to take our tape measure and we're going to measure from the bottom of the toe to where we are. And in my case, we are, let me adjust the tape just slightly. We are pretty much at the 2-inch mark. And that's kind of where I like to have my socks. And as you can see, now we're getting ready to start the next color. So now you want to get your main color ready, and you should have already divided those out evenly. And generally speaking, it's about 100 grams of yarn for a sock without color changes. So if you've got that much and you've divided them into 50-gram balls, you should have plenty of yarn to make 2 socks. So now we're getting back to magic loop position, and we're going to pull the bottom needle out. And so in order to do a color change, it is very, very simple. So you're going to start by just grabbing about grabbing the beginning of your yarn and leaving probably about 6 inches of yarn, and you are literally going to take your needle and you are going to insert it into that very first stitch as you would just like you're getting ready to knit the first stitch, which we are. So we're going to insert that needle, and then you're going to take that yarn that you've kind of folded over and have a little bit of an 6-inch tail, and you're just going to loop it over the needle leaving, like I said, 6 inches or so, because we're going to use that to weave in the ends after we have finished the sock. And then you're going to just take it and you're going to pull it through, hold on to it, and you're just going to pull it through as if you're going to knit. And then you knit it off. Okay, so what I like to do now is I like to take the tail of the yarn and drop it, because we're not working with that, right? So now you are going to knit with the working yarn. You're going to, just like you normally would. So you are going to put it through the second stitch, and you're just going to knit normal. Now what's going to happen is that first stitch is going to be a little loose, but that's okay, because that is what happens when you change colors in the round, or change colors generally. So that is not going to be an issue. So now you're just going to start knitting with the new color as normal, and I'll show you what happens when we get around to back to the beginning of the round. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of the first sock. Don't forget to drop your working yarn from your first sock, and we're going to do the exact same thing with the second sock. Okay, so I'm grabbing my yarn from my second skein, my second ball, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We are going to insert our needle into that first stitch as if to knit. And then we are going to, like I said, leave about a 6-inch tail. We're going to fold it over, and we're just going to slide that loop on, and we're going to knit it off. Okay. And then we are going to continue to knit. Make sure you drop the tail, because we want to make sure we're working with the yarn that is coming from the skein. And you're just going to knit evenly with that skein. I'm sorry, yeah, with that yarn, and you are going to continue until you have completed one full round of knitting with your color change. And then I'll show you what happens when we get back to the beginning. So we have now completed one full round of knitting with the new colorway. And we want to make sure we get ourselves adjusted and keep our yarns from getting tangled. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see this. So now, as you can see, we still have our working yarn, the new color on the back needle, and we've got a tail from the new colorway, and we still have our old color, the flaxseed color, attached to the ball. So now we're going to grab a pair of scissors, and we want to cut that toe color, because we are done with it for the moment, and we want to leave about another 6 inches of tail, because we want to be able to weave that in later. And so now you're done with that toe color. Okay, we're going to set that skein aside. We're done with it. So what I like to do for my color changes is to keep everything kind of tight and snug. I take the two ends and I will basically, not a knot, but I just tie them together securely. And then I take those two ends and I just push those inside the sock, and I kind of forget about them for right now. So that's what we're going to do right here is we're just going to push those tails into the inside sock, and we are going to forget about them until we get ready to weave in our ends at the end of our knitting. So let's go ahead and get ready to start knitting again. So now like I said, we've completed a successful color change, and we're going to insert our needle into the first stitch, and we're going to tug up tightly on that stitch, and we are just going to continue. Now that stitch may still be slightly loose, but that is not going to be an issue. Like I said earlier, we'll take care of all of the tightening when we get to the end as we're finishing up the sock. So I will show you again one more time on the second sock how we join in our second color. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of the first sock. So drop our working yarn. Let's go to the next sock. And once again, we have our working yarn with the new color coming from the back. And then we've got the tail end from the new yarn on the front. And then we've got our old color still attached to the ball. So we're going to take a pair of scissors and we're going to cut that yarn, and then we're just going to tie the two ends together and snug up those two ends so that we can later on come back and weave in those ends. So give it a good snug. And as you're knitting, you will notice maybe on the second and maybe even the third row after the color change, you might have to come back in to these, and tighten those up just a little bit, because like I said, they're going to still be a little on the loose side, but that is not going to be an issue. But if it bothers you, you can continue to tighten until you are 1 or 2 rows above the color change. So now you're just going to go ahead and continue to knit with the new color, and you will do that until the sock measures 2 inches from your total foot. And I will show you here in just a moment a diagram that will make it a little bit easier for you to understand. So you're going to continue to knit with the new color until that sock measures 2 inches short of your total foot. Okay, so now we're back, and we want to stop knitting in our main color when we get to where we are 2 inches short of our foot. So from the beginning of the foot, you're going to stop 2 inches short, okay? Because this is where we're going to be placing our locking stitch marker or bulb stitch markers for the back of the heel. So guys, I place my stitch markers at 2 inches, but someone like Kirby Werby on her tutorial, she does 1 3/4. So I can't really tell you exactly where you should place yours. It just depends on what you think you need. So this is the front of the sock. So you are going to knit the instep all the way till you get to the back, and then I'll show you what to do once we get to the back of the sock on the heel, so that I can show you where to place the stitch markers. So just knit evenly across the front instep. So now we have finished knitting across the front of the socks, and now we're to the back of the socks. So basically we are going to knit evenly on the back until we get to that very last stitch, and this is where we are going to place our stitch marker. And the reason why we do that, we're going to do it on both socks. The reason why we do that, or reason why I do that, this is not mandatory for Afterthought heels, but I think it's if you are new to the Afterthought heel, it's easier to put stitch markers where you are going to insert your needles when you're getting ready to pick up your stitches. It just, like I said, it just makes it easier. So this first locking stitch marker is going to represent one side of the heel where we are going to, it's basically like a place marker is what it is. And you'll understand it a little bit more when we get to actually knitting the Afterthought heel. So like I said, just go ahead and knit all the way down till you get to that last stitch, and we're going to place a stitch marker on that stitch. So we are coming to the end of the sock, and you're going to go ahead and knit that last stitch normal. So just go ahead and knit it normal, because now we are going to now add the stitch marker. And you want it to be one of the ones that can open up, so it can be this bulb stitch marker, or it can be any other stitch marker. These are somewhat thin in nature, and I like those. The other ones tend to be slightly bulky, and so I like these a little bit better. So you're going to insert it. See if I can get it a closer shot. You're just going to insert it into that last stitch and just let it hang out there until we finish the sock. So now that we've added that, we are now going to knit across this sock and do the exact same thing. We're coming to the end of the second sock. So now we are also going to do the exact same thing. We're going to take a locking stitch marker and we're going to place it on that very last stitch. So at this point, we want to once again knit the front stitches, and then I'll talk about what we need to do when we get to the back stitches for our second stitch marker. Okay, so we are back on the heel side again of our sock, and as you can see, that's where we placed the first stitch marker. So now it's time for us to place the second stitch marker, and this time we're going to place the stitch marker dead center based on the number of stitches that we have. So for my sock, I have a total of 64 stitches, so 32 on the front and 32 on the back. So I'm going to place my stitch marker at 16, but if you have a 60 count stitch sock, then you would place your marker at 30. And actually for this particular one, you just have to get close. It just has to be somewhat close to the middle. It doesn't have to be dead on a spot center, because this is the stitch that we are going to cut to start unraveling for our Afterthought heel. So it just needs to be somewhat close to the center. And so we're just going ahead and knit as we normally would the back stitches, and then when we get to the halfway mark, we're going to place our second locking stitch marker. So now we are approaching the halfway mark on our sock, and like I said, for your sock your stitch count may be slightly different. So we're going to take our second locking stitch marker and put it on the stitch that is at the halfway mark. So now that we've placed that stitch marker, we're just going to knit to the end of this sock, and we are going to repeat the same thing on the second sock. Okay, so we are approaching the end of the second sock. We've come to that first stitch marker. Just knit normal and ignore it hanging out there. And so now we are going to start on the second sock and put the stitch marker at the halfway point. Okay, so now it's time to place the marker on the second sock. And once we do that, then we'll just continue to the end of the sock, and I'll show you where to place the last locking stitch marker. So once you come to the end of this row, go ahead and knit across the front stitches on the both socks, and then come back around to the back heel. Okay, so now we're to the back stitches once again, and so this time the stitch marker is going to be placed at the beginning of this round. So it's going to be on the very first stitch of this sock. So basically we're doing this because we want to, once we finish the sock, we won't necessarily know where our stitches are on the back needle. So this is basically marking the stitches for the first stitch on one side and the last stitch on the other side. So go ahead and place your locking stitch marker on that very first stitch. And so this is the last stitch marker that you are going to need, that will help you with the Afterthought heel. Now, is this necessary to do? Absolutely not, like I said earlier in the tutorial, but for first time Afterthought heel, if you've never done it before, it actually kind of helps, so that you're not concerned about where to begin the Afterthought heel as far as where your first stitch is. So now we're on to the next sock. So let's go ahead and place that locking stitch marker where it needs to be on the first stitch, and just knit evenly to the end of this round. So now we are done with placing all of our stitch markers. Yay! So we are going to be now back. This is just showing the back of the sock just for reference. So you've got 3 markers on the back, one at the first stitch marker, one in the middle on the row below, and one on the end, the row below that one. So you should have a total of 3 stitch markers per sock. Okay, so we're back to the beginning of the round, and I want to bring back the other Afterthought heel sock that I did just so you could, just to show you for reference again. So you are just going to continuously knit in the round as long as you want your leg to be until we get to the ribbing part of the sock. So now go ahead and just continue to knit in the round for as long as you would like to have your sock leg. So now I have knit my leg of the sock to the length that I like. I like a sock that's a little bit longer than an ankle sock, so that kind of works for me. But you can knit your sock to the leg to the desired length that you like it to be. So now we are ready on my sock to begin the ribbing portion of the sock. So we're going to grab our contrasting color, and we are going to start knitting with that ball of yarn. Now here's a note for ribbing. When you are starting a color change on a row where you're going to begin ribbing, always on the color change round, knit an even round before you start the ribbing. So if you were to start the color change and immediately start ribbing, then you would be able to see the color change through the purl bumps, and that's not what we're wanting for a very clean look for our color change. So as we have done before, we are going to grab our color, and we are going to insert our needle into the first stitch as if to knit. Be sure and remember to leave at least a 6-inch tail so that we can weave that in later. That helps us with tidying up and making sure that we don't have any holes in our socks. So let's go ahead and insert the needle into the first stitch, and we're just going to loop the color change over the needle like we did for the socks. Like we did for the toes, sorry. And then we're just going to continuously knit one even round with this color change. So don't forget that you want to drop the tail and just work with the yarn that is coming from the ball of the yarn. So continue to knit across the first sock and do the exact same thing for the color change on the second sock. And I'll meet you back at the beginning of the row. So now we're back to the beginning of the round for the second sock. And as I said earlier, we're going to continue to do the same thing on this sock as the first sock. So make sure, the most important thing that you can do is to make sure you leave enough tail to weave in for the color change. So you're going to leave probably about another like 6 inches of tail. Like I said before, you're going to insert your needle into the first stitch and wrap that new color over the needle, pull through, and then knit your stitch off, and then you're going to make sure you drop the tail of the yarn, and you're going to pick up the working part of the yarn and just continue to knit with the new color. Okay, so we have knit one even row all the way around with the contrast color for our cuff. And so now it's time for us to cut the yarn from the main color because we don't need that anymore for this portion of the sock. So let's leave about a 6-inch tail on that as well. And let's just go ahead and give it a snip. So let's go ahead and tie our ends together just to secure those so that they won't come undone. And we will take care of that again, as I said earlier, at the end of the sock when we're finishing it up. And that way it'll make a little bit of a less loose stitch for that first stitch on the needle. So just snug it up as tight as you can and then take those two ends and just kind of tuck them inside the sock. So now once you do that, we are going to begin our I like to do 2x2 ribbing. That is a personal choice for me. It is up to you. You can do whatever type ribbing that you like on your socks, 1x1, 2x2, 1x3, whatever is comfortable for you. And this is where you would begin doing that. So be sure on that first stitch to make sure that stitch is somewhat tight, because you want to make sure that you're not leaving any holes for gaps or you don't want your sock to have laddering. So go ahead and continue as you would in whatever ribbing that you have decided on. I'm going to go ahead and speed through this or cut this particular part out. If you need to reference specifically how to do it, go back to that first tutorial with the Fleegle heel. It's a little bit slower and you'll be able to understand a little bit better if you're not sure how to do the ribbing on this sock. So I don't want this tutorial to be too long, so we're going to go ahead and speed through this part and we'll come back and I'll show you how I cast off. So now I am finished with my ribbing. I did 20 rounds. I like to do 20 rounds of ribbing on my sock. That's a personal preference, as always. So it's nice and stretchy, and I actually love 2x2 ribbing. So now it's time to do the Jenny Surprisingly Stretchy bind off. Okay, so in order to start Jenny Surprisingly Stretchy bind off, we are going to start with a reverse yarn over. Unlike the traditional yarn over that goes from front to back, we're going from back to front on here. So we've done the reverse yarn over, and then we're going to knit the second stitch normal. And then we've got 2 stitches on our right needle. So now we're going to pass 1 stitch over the other stitch. So I don't know what it is, but for some reason this patent croy sock yarn, it was very splitty throughout the whole knitting of the sock. So I was not really a huge fan of it. And I've used patent croy before, so I'm not sure if it was just this particular skein or what, but not a fan. Okay, so now we're going to do another reverse yarn over, and we're going to knit the next stitch. And now we've got 3 stitches on our right needle, and we're going to take that middle stitch and we are going to pass it over the last stitch. And so now we have 2 stitches on our needle. Now we're going to take the other stitch and pass it over that's the second stitch, and now we will have only 1 stitch left on the needle. So now we are coming to a purl stitch, and what we want to do is wrap the yarn from the front to the back of the needle when we are presented with a purl stitch that's coming up next. So loop the yarn around the back side of the needle, and then we're going to purl normal and purl off. And so now you will have 3 stitches again on your right needle, and you can pass those stitches one at a time over, or you can have the option of passing both of the end stitches over at the same time. It's just a personal preference. There's lots of tutorials out there on Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy bind off. I know in this tutorial with working with fingering weight yarn, it's a little difficult to see, so I encourage you to check out those tutorials as well. So we're back to another purl stitch. So we're going to wrap from the front to the back, and we're going to insert as if to purl, and we're going to go ahead and take those stitches off one at a time or two at a time, depending upon what you like. So you will continue in this method with Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off, and I will see you at the end of this sock. Okay, so now we've come to the last 3 stitches on the first sock, and we're going to go ahead and pull those over to where we have 1 stitch left on the sock. Now this is what I like to do. I don't know what others do on their socks, but I don't like to leave just 1 stitch on a needle, especially when I'm doing 2 at a time. It just seems a little fiddly to me. So actually what I like to do is I like to take a locking stitch marker, and I like to place it through that last stitch, and I take it off the needle. You certainly don't have to, but that's actually what I like to do. So by doing this, we don't have to worry about that 1 stitch being left, for me anyway, on that needle. So now that needle is free, and I can start knitting on the second sock without that 1 stitch being left. So we will complete Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off on this second sock, and I'll come back and show you what we do with the sock that has the locking stitch marker. So I've completed nearly a full round of binding off on this second sock. So now I'm down to the last 3 stitches of this sock, and I'll show you what I do next. Now we only have 1 stitch left on the needle, so I like to pull that stitch up, and I will cut the working yarn. And once I cut the working yarn, then I will thread it through the loop to secure the sock. And then we'll come back at the end and we'll weave in our ends. But this first sock, this was actually the second sock. It is completely done. It's super stretchy. The bind off looks amazingly great. I highly recommend this bind off for any of your toe up socks. I think it's a really great bind off. And so when you bind off like this, there's a little bit of a gap in between where you bind off versus where you start. We're going to close that up when we weave in our ends. At least that's how I do my socks. So now we've got this 1 sock left with this extremely long cord, and so we are going to position our cord where we're going to continue with magic loop. So we're going to still take the front needle and push the yarn in just like we would normal regular magic loop. But what we're going to do with that back needle is I'm going to take the locking stitch marker off and put it back on that back needle. So just make sure you pull that loose stitch a little bit tighter, and now you will just continue with the Jenny Surprisingly Stretchy bind off where you left off, and you'll go ahead and do that across the back stitches on this sock, and you will complete it just as you did the other sock. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward so that we can get to the end. So this is the final 3 stitches on our last sock, and we will continue and bind off in pattern with Jenny Surprisingly Stretchy bind off, and we will end up doing the exact same thing that we did on the first sock. So go ahead and cut your working yarn and weave it through the open loop, or however you like to end your stitches. And we are done with the main part of both of these socks. And now it's on to the Afterthought heel. So we are now done with the main body of the sock. We are going to pick up stitches from the black locking stitch marker, and we're going to pick up stitches from the yellow locking stitch marker, and of course the one in the middle is holding the stitch that we're going to cut. Okay, so we're ready for the Afterthought heel. My sock is oriented to where the cuff is at the top and the toes are at the bottom. So what we want to do is go ahead and insert our needle into that first stitch that was held by the black locking stitch marker. And as you can see, I've picked that up. And we basically want to pick up the right leg of every stitch on that row. It's going to be a little difficult to see because this entire row is pink, but I will tell you that it's very easy to get off on a row when the color is the same. And I actually did that on the back of this sock, but I realized that, and I pulled out the stitches that were on the incorrect row and put them back on the needle the correct way. So I'm going to be picking up 32 stitches on this back needle, because that is how many stitches that I did on this back row. So I had a total of 64 stitches. So I'm going to pick up 32. So depending upon how many stitches you cast on for your socks, if your sock was 60 stitches, you're going to pick up 30 stitches. So just make sure that you try your best to stay on the right row and not go on a different row like I did. So I suggest that when you are doing the Afterthought heel, to make sure that you are in a well-lit area so that you'll be able to see where you're picking up your stitches. And sometimes you have to spread your stitches out to kind of see where the right leg is. So just like I said, take your time and just methodically pick up the right stitch, and then just kind of come back and look to see if you have picked up the right row for your stitches. So we're coming to the last stitch on the back of the sock, and make sure you count. It's very important to count to make sure that you have picked up the correct number of stitches for your socks. And in this case, like I said, mine was 32, and fortunately I did have 32 stitches on the needle. So now what you want to do is you want to pull the cord, your needle through where the cord is now on the needles, because it'll make it much easier for you to pick up the remaining stitches. So turn your sock over, and so now we want to pick up the first stitch on the other side. So this is the where the yellow stitch marker is. So this is going to be stitch 1 after we've turned our sock over, and I'm going to pick up 32 stitches on this side. So go ahead and just make sure you methodically, like I said, pick up the stitches. If it's your first time doing the Afterthought heel, don't get frustrated. There are times when you might have to pull back the needle out of the stitches because for some reason you missed a stitch, etc. But that's not a big deal. Like I said, it's just one of those things. And as you get used to the Afterthought heel, it gets easier as you continue to do them. And so don't get frustrated by if it's your first time picking up stitches for the Afterthought heel, because I've done probably 3 or 4 socks with the Afterthought heel, so I wouldn't consider myself to be a professional by any means. And sometimes I have to pull back my work, and it's okay. It really is okay. And just look at your work, and if you need to spread your stitches out to make sure that you're picking up the right leg, that's okay as well. So here's a tip maybe for first time Afterthought heel knitters. You might want to put your stitch markers, locking stitch markers, where you have a color change. Where mine is kind of still in the pink section, you would have maybe put your stitch markers where the pink and the blue changed. That way you would have to pick up stitches on the pink side and on the blue side. So that might have made it a little bit easier for you to see. That's just a tip as I'm going back and looking at and narrating, of course, this tutorial. That probably would have been a little bit easier for you guys to see. And for some reason, when I was picking up stitches on this side of the sock, I was actually having trouble picking up the stitches, and you probably can see that. But I didn't, of course, get discouraged. Like I said, I just took my time picking up the stitches. And it was, I don't know, for some reason, this yarn was a tad bit on the splitty side. And this is a Knit Picks Fleegle, and I never have issues with that. So it's probably more of a user issue than anything else. So but yes, I'm, like I said, just picking up the stitches, taking my time, and I'm not fast forwarding through this part of the tutorial because I want you guys to see everything, my struggles with it, etc. Okay, so I'm just plugging along and plugging along, and you will see in just a few short moments that I realize that I'm picking up the wrong row toward the end. And I know why, because the color actually changed on this row, and so therefore I missed the row somewhere halfway because I thought I was still picking up the right row, and I was not. And once I pick up the last stitch, you'll see where I realize that I have picked up the wrong row. I don't know if you can see where I've picked up the wrong row, but now I realize that I have. So don't panic, just pull the stitches back to where you were on the correct row, and then go back and start picking up the correct row. It's just that easy and simple. I say that, but really, maybe not. No, it really is that simple. I'm just kidding. You just, like I said, you just have to be patient and take your time when you are picking up stitches for the first time with the Afterthought heel, and you should be perfectly fine. So here I'm just taking a step back to just make sure that I am picking up the right stitches, because sometimes when you come to that middle stitch marker, it's a little tough to go past it to make sure you're picking up the right stitches. But like I said, if you just continue on, you should be a-okay. Now I will go ahead and just fast forward just a little bit until we get to the end of this row, just so that this video is not going to be too extremely long. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so now that we've come to the end of the sock on this side, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we count our stitches as we did before to make sure that we have picked up 32 stitches, or the number that you need on this side of the sock. So in my case, I have picked up too many stitches. So just slide your needle back and take out the number of stitches that you don't need and reinsert your needle, and you should be fine. So go ahead and pull your cord through. Of course, you want to make sure that you leave a loop on the other end, because this is magic loop, right? So now I've turned my sock around and I want to get into ready position. But the first thing we're going to do is we are going to snip the stitch that's being held by the red locking stitch marker. Here's the fun part, or at least I think it's the fun part, the unpicking. So go ahead and grab you a good pair of scissors, and what you want to do is you want to snip, make sure and only snip that stitch that's being held. So you want to get either another set of needles, or in my case, I just pulled through a little bit, and I'm going to use the needles that I actually am knitting with. But whatever your preference is, you can grab a second set of needles and start unpicking. Now, I will tell you, I had the most difficult time unpicking this particular sock. And I think it was because of how I picked up the stitches. Somehow the yarn was interlocked, so I think I may have, and this is what happens sometimes when you split stitches when you're picking them up. Your unpicking of the stitches is not as clean as you would like it, but unfortunately you just kind of have to work through it and hope that you picked up your stitches a little bit more cleanly than I did on this sock. The struggles are real, guys. So I might not be the best example for unpicking these stitches in this particular video, but just know that if you pick up your stitches cleanly, you shouldn't have any struggles. But like I said, this is real life here, and if you are a first time Afterthought heel, this could happen to you. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you see the struggles through this video. I might speed it up toward the end, but like I said, I did have issues picking up these stitches. And like I said, this is real life for me. I'm not a perfectionist when it comes to knitting, but I kind of a go with the flow kind of person. So if you are a perfectionist, this probably would drive you a little crazy. But like I said, in the end, if you just take your time and go through, pick up your stitches correctly, then you may not have some of the issues that I have had. This is the first time actually that I've had issues picking the stitches apart. So I couldn't really tell you exactly what happened. I think I split some stitches, because sometimes when I'm doing tutorials, it's kind of hard to knit when the camera is kind of in your face. So I'm not blaming that on that, but that very well could have been what happened in this situation. So anyway, so like I said, just continue to unpick your stitches. We're going to do once. I like to do one side normally and then come back and do the other side. But that is absolutely a personal preference. You can pick up the stitches on some on one side and then come back and pick up stitches on the other side, or you can go back and forth. There's no right or wrong to how you pick up the stitches. Okay, so now we seem to be past the sticky part, so pulling, unraveling the yarn is going to go by much faster. Now, the key to having an afterthought heel with no holes is to make sure that you do not unravel to the very end of your sock. Okay, so you want to continue to unpick your stitches until you have about 2 stitches left on this side of the sock, and therefore that's going to keep you from getting a hole in your sock. So just like I said, just continue to unpick until you have 2 stitches left on this side. Okay guys, you see right here, I accidentally split a stitch from the back side of the other sock when I was picking it up. It's kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to fix that when I get ready to start knitting again. But I split the stitch from the back side. I don't know how I did that, but I did. Like I said, this is real life knitting. Okay, so now we have 2 stitches left on this side of the sock. So just take that tail in and just tuck it in. Tuck it on the inside of the sock. So now we want to start on the other side, and we want to do the exact same thing. We want to unpick all of our stitches until we have 2 stitches left on this side. Okay, so I'm going to speed up on this side because I don't want you to necessarily see the struggles on this side as well, because you saw them on the first side. But just pick all of your stitches until you have 2 stitches left on that side as well, and we'll come back and I'll tell you what's next. So now we've come to the last 2 stitches on this side, and we are going to take our yarn and put it on the inside. And I ended up having to cut part of my yarn out on this side because it was stuck so bad. So now my tail is a little too short, but we'll fix that at the end of the sock when we are weaving in our ends. So look guys, we have a nice hole in our back sock for our heel. Like I said, don't worry about that part that's hanging on. I'm going to fix that in just a moment. So now we want to get to magic loop ready position, and we want to grab our contrast yarn color, because now we are going to start knitting with the secondary color. And you're going to start the same way that you did with the ribbing. We're going to leave about a 6-inch tail on our secondary color. We're going to, like I said, get back to ready position by inserting our needle back into the sock. And we are going to pull the back needle long. And we are now ready to start knitting with our second color. So insert your needle into the first loop, drape your new color over, pull it through so you've knitted one stitch off, and now drop the tail of that second yarn and start knitting in the round. Now you normally with the Afterthought heel, you would usually knit, and actually it's a personal preference. Once again, you can knit 2 full rounds to give your Afterthought heel a little bit more depth. But for me, I find that I need to knit a full 5 knit rows, even rows before even starting the decrease because of the way that my heel is. Okay guys, so the way that I picked up my stitches, all of my stitches on this side are oriented the incorrect way. So basically they're sitting on the needle backwards. So in order to fix that, I'm going to just knit through the back loop, and that will twist the stitch the correct way. Or you can take the stitch off the needle and orient it back the correct way and then just knit normally. So now we've come to the stitch where I accidentally picked up, split the stitch on the back side, and I'm sorry that I got this off of camera, but basically what I did was I slid that stitch off and made sure that that split stitch was put back on correctly so that it disconnected from that back stitch. I know it's hard to explain, but just know that I fixed it. And so now we're going to continue to knit across the front stitch. And as I said, I am knitting through the back loop of each of these stitches because of the way that I picked up these stitches. And if you are a knitter of any time, you'll know when your stitches are backwards. It just feels funny when you get ready to insert your stitch. And also you can look at your stitches and tell that they are oriented incorrectly. And if you notice that, like I said, you can just knit through the back loop as I'm doing here on every single stitch, or change the orientation of the stitch, correct it, put it back on the needle, and just knit it normally. So I forgot to tell you to go ahead and place a stitch marker or locking stitch marker on this side of your sock underneath where you're knitting, so that you'll know that you're at the beginning of the round when you get to this side. So now we're done with the first side of the sock. And so you want to take your new colorway, the tails, and make sure you put those on the inside of the sock so that we can weave those in later. But as I said earlier, if you want to go ahead and knit 5 extra rounds, five rounds even on your sock, you definitely can do that. You may have a little bit more room than you intend to. It's strictly up to you. I know that when I knit my first Afterthought heel, I only knit 2 even rounds before the decreases, and it wasn't quite enough, so I adjusted that on future socks. So honestly, it is really up to you as to how many even rounds you want to knit before you start your decreases. So you will continue knitting in the round for the specified number of stitches that you would like. I'm sorry, the specified number of rows that you would like. And then we will come back here and start the decrease row. So on this row as well, I had to knit through the back stitches, because I orient these, when I picked up the stitches on this side as well, they were oriented incorrectly, which is not a big deal. So just knit your stitches based on how they are oriented on the needle, and you should be fine. But once you do this, once you knit through the back loop or you reorient them correctly, you don't have to worry about that with the rest of the sock, because they will be oriented the correct way. So now we knit one even row around of knitting for our socks. So I'm going to pull back the camera so you get a better angle. So we are going to continue to knit evenly in the round based on the number of rows that are desired for your sock before we start the decreasing. Okay, so I have knit my 5 even rows, and I told you earlier that I placed a stitch marker on this side so I would know when I got to this side I was at the beginning of the round. So we're going to now start the decrease row. We're going to decrease at the beginning and the end of each side of the sock. So now we need to get to ready position, and we are going to begin our decrease row. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to knit the first stitch, and then we are going to perform an SSK, which is a slip knit stitch. Go in as if to knit, and you're going to slip that stitch off. On the second one, you're going to do the exact same thing. Go in as if to knit and slip it off, and then you're going to take your left needle and put it in front of those 2 stitches, and then you're going to knit those stitches off, and now you have made 1 decrease. So now you're going to knit across the stitches on the front needle all the way till you get to the last 3 stitches on this needle, and I'll tell you what to do next. So now we're down to the last 3 stitches on the front needle. So now we are going to perform a knit 2 together for these next two stitches by inserting your needle into the next 2 stitches and knitting those together. And now you've made 1 decrease, and then on the last stitch you're just going to do a normal knit stitch. Turn your work over, get back to ready position for magic loop. And then we're going to do the exact same thing on the back needle. So we're going to insert our needle into the first stitch on the back side. We're going to knit the first stitch, and then we're going to perform an SSK as we did earlier. Slip, slip, knit. Put the needle in the front of those 2 slipped stitches, and then we're going to knit those 2 together and knit those off of the stitch, off of the needle, and it will be a decrease. And then we're going to go ahead and knit across to the other end of the sock until we have 3 stitches left on that end, and we will perform a knit 2 together. Okay, so now we're down to the last 3 stitches. We will perform a knit 2 together and then knit the last stitch on this needle. So what's going to happen now is the next row is just going to be a complete round of knitting even with no decreases. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a decrease row and a knit even row and a decrease row until we are down to the desired number of stitches that we want to have. So for me, the general rule of thumb is however many stitches that you cast on for the toe would be the number of stitches that you would decrease down to for the heel. So I cast on 14 stitches for the heel, for the toe. So I'm going to decrease down to 14 stitches on the heel. So I'm not going to show you the decrease and the increase row because I've just shown you right now. So I'm going to fast forward this until I have gotten down to the 14 stitches because like I said as earlier, I don't want this tutorial to be just too lengthy. So we're back and we are down to the desired number of stitches that we would like. So here I would advise you, if you would like, because I'm not going to show you the Kitchener stitch. This is where you would perform the Kitchener stitch if you were going to. I would put in a lifeline here just in case you do not like the alternative method that I'm about to show you, and that way you can rip out the sock and go back and put in the Kitchener stitch if you need to. So I just want to mention that I do not own any rights to any of the techniques in this tutorial. The new bind off that I'm going to show you, I saw on Addicted to Sock Knitting Facebook group that was posted by one of their members. Her name was Melanie Carroll, and what she likes to do instead of the Kitchener stitch, she just likes to do a knit two all the way around and close off her toes as you would the top of a hat. So this is the method that I tried for these socks for the heel. I literally just knit two together all the way around, and then I closed up the heel as if I would a hat. Now here's what I have learned from this technique from knitting this way on the back of the sock. I think that I should have decreased a little bit further than 14 stitches because of this method, because I think the decrease on this basically almost negated the 5 even rows that I knit evenly to give me a little bit extra room. So like I said, this was my first time trying this method, and basically you're going to knit, like I said, knit 2 stitches together all the way around. Very simple, very, very simple. It gives you a nice look on the heel, but I should have probably decreased down to at least 10 stitches, and that way that would have given me the extra room that I needed on this sock. Now this is a disclaimer that I'm going to tell you about this method. I have not worn this sock with by knitting the 2 at a time on here, so I don't know how it's going to wear in comparison to the Kitchener stitch. I think that knitting is just a work of art, and you need to try things, and I am definitely one of those people to try things. I don't like my knitting to be stressful. The Kitchener stitch is not stressful. It's just something that I have to look up every time that I do it, because I don't do it often. So I think doing the knit 2 togethers, that's very intuitive to me, and I actually like the look of it at the end when I finished it. So like I said, I tried it in this tutorial to give you an alternative to the Kitchener stitch. But like I said, I would advise you that if you're going to do it, to knit to decrease a little bit further than past the number of stitches that you started with, just to give you a little bit more room in the heel if you need it. Okay, so now I'm done with knitting the knit 2s together all the way around. So I'm going to cut my yarn as if I would the top of a hat. So I'm going to thread a tapestry needle, and I couldn't find the one that I needed for this tutorial, so I had to make do with a smaller one. And let me tell you, that was a little challenging. But just go ahead and thread your needle through your tapestry needle, and I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so now I've got my tapestry needle threaded. So now we're just going to start threading the tapestry needle through each of the stitches, and basically taking those off of the needle. And we're going to continue to do that on all of the needle, all of the stitches on the front needle until they are completely taken off. And then we are basically going to pull the yarn through those stitches, and we are going to pull those generously through until the whole entire tail of the yarn is through all of those stitches. And then we're going to turn the sock around and do the same thing for the back stitches. Just take those off, and I actually need to pull the needle through to the other end to orient that correctly, to get those actually to slide off of the needle. So push your needle, your stitches through your needle, and get those oriented right. Now go ahead and slide those off of the needle onto off of your knitting needle onto your tapestry needle, and then you're going to pull those through just like you would the top of a hat. So now you can see why I think I should have decreased a little bit further, because it actually tightened up my heel just a little more than I would have liked to. But I think I can negate that by adding a few more rows of knits and decreases. So now you're going to take your, what I do is I take my needle and take it and put it through the hole, and I will turn the sock inside out to close up that hole, and then I would just basically weave in my ends to close up the hole. Now, like I said, I have not worn this sock to see how it wears with this type of a closure, but I don't see how it would be any different than if you were to do this procedure or do this technique for the toes. And like I said, Melanie hasn't had any issues on her socks with doing this for the toes. So I figure, you know what, I'll just try it for the heel. So that is the alternative for the Kitchener stitch. I don't know if you're going to like it or not. Like I said, it is strictly up to you whether you want to try it, but it's just nice to have an alternative if you don't like the Kitchener stitch. And there's no scientific way to weave in your ends. Just make sure you do the best that you can and that you've closed up the hole on the stitches. You do want to make sure they're nice and even. You want to make sure that they're even when you're doing this, because you don't want any bulk to be on the back of your heel, because that may be a little bit of a discomfort to you. But see, as you can see, it looks like it's a pretty good, nice looking heel with this type of method. Okay, so this is what the heel looks like once you have woven in the ends. It's kind of a nice looking heel, not too bad. So we can compare it to the Fleegle heel and see which one you like the best as far as the aesthetics. Okay, here they are side by side. The gray is the alternative method. The green is the Fleegle heel. And as you can see, the Fleegle heels has a little bit more of a boxier look. But I think, like I said, if I had just decreased a little bit further with the gray, it probably would have given me a little bit more room in the heel of the sock. Okay, so let's turn our sock inside out so we can start weaving in our ends where we have the color changes. So the first one up is where we change the color at the toe. So remember how we just kind of tied it across to make a, not in a knot, but just tied it in a loop. So basically we're going to take each of those ends on the color chain, and we're going to weave those in going in the opposite direction so that so that the hole will stay closed up in our socks. Now remember to do this for every single color change that we had in this sock. Like I said, just make sure there's no scientific method or knitting method for weaving in ends. Just make sure you get a good amount of that you are confident that you have woven in the ends. So once you do this one side, then you'll go ahead and do the other side going the opposite direction, and that should secure all of your color changes throughout all of the socks. So go ahead and do that for all of the color changes that you have on the inside of the sock. Okay guys, so we are done with knitting our sock. This tutorial has gone a little bit longer than I wanted it to, but like I said, I wanted to explain everything in this tutorial. And as you can see, there are no holes in this sock on this side or the other side because we did not take our stitches out all the way when we were doing the Afterthought heel. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this tutorial. Please like and subscribe, and let me know if there's any other things that you would like to see in tutorial form. I appreciate you giving me the love and support that you've given me on this channel, and I definitely appreciate it. So I will talk to you guys later. Also, if you guys have any questions about something that I may not have covered in this tutorial, please do as you have always done and contact me or leave me comments at the bottom of this tutorial, and I'll be more than happy to try to come back and explain or help you out on an individual basis. Okay, bye-bye.